So in the 1930s, the Empire of Japan sets off on this path of massive expansion that basically sets all of Asia on fire and leads straight into a world war. It's a wild story of ambition, of crisis, and of some pretty radical ideas that completely reshaped the globe. So how did it all happen? Let's dig in.
And that's the big question, right? How does a country that was pretty much cut off from the world for centuries suddenly transform itself into a massive empire in just a handful of decades? To figure this out, we've got to go back to where it all began, where those first seeds of ambition were planted.
All right, so first up, the seeds of ambition. You see, before any army marches, an idea has to take hold. An idea of destiny, of being special, of having a mission.
Okay, so it really all kicks off here, back in 1868, with something called the Meiji Restoration. And look, this wasn't just some casual upgrade. This was a national project born out of pure fear. Japan looked around and saw Western powers carving up China, colonizing their neighbors, and the thinking was brutally simple: become a powerhouse or get carved up like everyone else.
And wow, did this drive for strength pay off? It paid off in a huge way. First, they win against China. But then, in 1905, something happens that sends shockwaves around the entire planet. They defeat Russia. I mean, think about that. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had beaten a major European empire. This wasn't just a win on the battlefield. This was a huge psychological shot in the arm for the whole country.
And this poster, wow, it just perfectly captures the mood of the country. You've got this giant Japanese hand just crushing the Russian fleet. The title, 100 Victories, 100 Laughs, says it all. This gives you a real sense of the incredible pride and nationalism that was just exploding across Japan. A new idea starts to really take root. Maybe Japan's destiny isn't just to survive, but to lead.
So all that confidence starts to morph into this really intense ultra-nationalist ideology. It was a pretty powerful cocktail, right? You had the belief in a divine emperor, a ton of pride in their history of never being conquered, and this very compelling idea of an Asia for Asiatics, with Japan naturally as the leader who would free the continent from the West. Suddenly, expansion wasn't just foreign policy. For a lot of people, it felt like a sacred duty.
But, ideas alone don't start wars. These huge ideas about destiny, they need the right kind of soil to grow in. And in the 1920s and 30s, Japan was a nation in deep, deep crisis, which created the perfect storm for these radical ideas to absolutely flourish. The Great Depression just hammered Japan. The world economy tanks, and suddenly nobody's buying Japanese silk, which was a huge deal for them. Factories shut down, unemployment goes through the roof, and there's poverty and unrest everywhere. So the country is getting desperate for resources, for new places to sell their goods, and for land for its growing population.
And while all this is happening, the political system is just falling apart at the seams. The civilian government is weak, it's divided, and this all comes to a head in 1932 as something truly shocking. The Prime Minister himself is assassinated by a group of naval officers. I mean, this was a brazen move, and it basically killed off civilian politics, leaving this huge power vacuum.
So here's the bottom line. The military steps into this chaos and offers a simple solution for everything. They argued that invading places like Manchuria would get them the resources they needed, it would give land to the poor, and it would restore order and a sense of national pride. It was a really simple, powerful answer to a whole bunch of very complicated problems.
So, with the government in shambles and the public desperate for answers, the military was in the perfect spot to step in and basically take over the country's direction.
Okay, this chart reveals something absolutely crucial about how Japan's government was set up. You see, the army and the navy answered directly to the emperor. They didn't have to go through the prime minister or the rest of the civilian government at all. This gave them a staggering amount of independence. And what did that independence mean in practice? It meant the military could basically hold the government hostage. They could veto politicians they didn't like, and more importantly, they could launch military actions abroad without even getting approval from Tokyo. They weren't just a tool of the government anymore. They were well on their way to becoming the government.
And if you need one perfect example of this, look no further than the Mukden incident. In 1931, a group of Japanese army officers in Manchuria literally blew up a piece of their own railroad, blamed it on the Chinese, and used it as an excuse to invade the entire region. This wasn't an order from Tokyo. This was the army acting completely on its own, dragging the whole country into a war that it started.
Okay, so Japan is on the move, clearly breaking all the international rules. So the big question is, what's the rest of the world going to do about it?
Well, the world's great hope for peace, the League of Nations, gets its first big test. and it completely fails. The promise was that all the member countries would protect each other, but in reality, when a report from the League itself condemned Japan's invasion, nothing happened. There were no real consequences. So what did Japan do? They just quit the League and kept Manchuria. Collective security turned out to be nothing more than an empty promise.
And as historian Anthony Best notes, this whole episode really showed a fatal flaw in the system. Collective security means absolutely nothing if the big powers, like Britain and France, aren't willing to actually use force to back it up. They were distracted by their own problems, so the League was basically toothless. And this sent a crystal clear message to other aggressive powers, especially in Europe. The international community was all talk.
Meanwhile, in China, the actual target of all this aggression, things were a mess. They were in the middle of their own brutal civil war between the nationalists and the communists. The fighting was so bad that it wasn't until 1936, after a pretty dramatic kidnapping of the nationalist leader, that the two sides finally, reluctantly, agreed to a shaky truce to fight their common enemy, Japan.
All right, so the League of Nations is pretty much useless at this point, but another giant is slowly starting to wake up. Let's talk about the United States and how it went from wanting nothing to do with this to being on a collision course with Japan. Now, U.S. policy didn't flip overnight. It was more like a slow burn escalation. It started small, with just a policy of not officially recognizing Japan's conquest. But as Japan got more and more aggressive, the alarm bells started to get louder. By 1940, the U.S. started to get serious with economic pressure, cutting off things like scrap metal. And then, the final move, the real gut punch, a total embargo on oil. And for Japan's military, oil was everything.
And this is where we get into a really interesting historical debate. Did these sanctions actually stop Japan, or did they accidentally push them over the edge? Some historians argue that by cutting off that oil, the U.S. basically backed Japan into a corner, leaving them feeling like they had no choice but to strike out and seize resources by force, which, ironically, may have made the attack on Pearl Harbor more likely, not less.
So when you pull it all together, Japan's road to war wasn't just one thing. It really was a perfect storm. You had this powerful ideology, this belief in a special mission, you had a terrible crisis at home that made people desperate, and you had a military that was acting like its own country. All three of these things collided and pulled Japan right into the center of a global war.
And that leaves us with a final, really haunting question. When you look back at all of it, the failed diplomacy, the crisis at home, the unchecked aggression, was this whole catastrophic conflict inevitable? Or was there some turning point? Some different decision that could have been made by anyone involved that might have changed everything? It's definitely something to think about.